Hi, everyone. And thank you for joining us today. And especially thank you to James for joining us from Manitoba. James is a colleague and friend of mine who it seems like every time I bring up an interesting sounding local initiative, he'll tell me a story about his work in Winnipeg, doing something very inspiring. And I've been thinking for a while now that he should be here sharing these stories with us. And now he is, yay. So he is currently the co-director of the Center for Resilience at Canadian Mennonite University, where he teaches business, political studies, and economics. He serves as a board member of the Assiniboine Credit Union. He's been a part of Transition Winnipeg, an urban composting service, a locally sourced waste-free coffee shop, 3 co-housing projects, both rural and urban, and a local food distribution network. So a lot of things that are relevant to conversations we're currently having in this community of Hastings Highlands. And I'm really happy to have him here today as well to tie together what we've been talking about in the last sessions. Pardon me. So in our first session, we talked about changing our ideas of what the economy is to be broader and to see it as something that is sort of deeply embedded in our social spheres and in our ecological systems. And we have talked about degrowth and steady state as important ideas when thinking about meeting our needs for well-being and a just society, while also maintaining the capacity of our Earth's life support systems to continue to function. We've also talked a lot about what we mean when we discuss sustainability and what we are trying to sustain into the future. And last session, we talked a bit about imagining a well-being economy. And these are like big macro ideas and are important to engage with as big ideas. But I think we also want to know what these ideas mean for a place like Hastings Highlands in specific ways we can engage with to meet our current and future needs, which are local, place-based, have historical contexts, even as we are intertwined with people and places and stories and ecosystems around the world. So a lot of learning happens through doing and trying things out, and especially learning from people who have been doing this sort of thing in their communities. And for that reason, I'm very happy to present James Magnus-Johnston and to hear about his thoughts and experiences in being both a scholar of ecological economics and also a person who is part of this critical process of taking big inspiring ideas and working in collaboration to bring them into local contexts. So over to you, James. Thanks for being here.
You're welcome. Yeah, so I mean, you sort of just gave a really lovely shape of actually where something started and then how, you know, how they were translated into sort of a local context in ways that were fumbling and, you know, really imperfect and difficult, but really valuable for learning and for folks who are probably much like many of you in this group here. So so yeah, I mean, just to expand on what Sean just said, spent a whole bunch of time thinking about theory and big ideas, and it sounds like you've already talked about some of those big ideas. You know, what is sustainability? Is sustainability even possible? Is it desirable? What is well-being? How do you measure it? How do you live it? You know, what is care? And how do you build that into sort of a functioning, some kind of functioning system when things start falling apart, like right now, or when things are, or when the norms are challenged. So I'll repeat probably a little bit of what Sean's already talked about before, but then also show you some of this. Well, I'm going to start though by showing you how we tried to put some of these ideas into action through the Transition Network in Winnipeg, a group that does still exist, but which had sort of an explosion of activity for a little while, and then sort of fizzled out into little projects. And so Sean's listed a bunch of them. Some of those projects were carried forward by like-minded organizations that are adjacent to Transition Winnipeg, and some of them were carried forward by Transition itself. But Transition Winnipeg itself never saw itself as a sort of a formal organization with the capacity to do work. it saw itself as kind of an advocacy group to sort of initiate these projects and then and get them to move forward. So I'll share a little bit about, oh, can I host disabled participant screen sharing? Can I have permission to share my screen? Whomever has the permission for that.
Marilyn, did you get it? Yeah.
Yes, I'm trying to give access to whoever would like to share screen. So I just clicked that box. So try.
Okay, let's try again. All right, cool. All right, so transition. There we go. Okay, so we'll start here, and this is just a little overview when I was working as co-chair of this organization. So many of you already know what transition is. At its best, it's a neighborhood-based initiative to increase our quality of life, adapt to contemporary challenges like climate change and economic volatility. And you know, I think this was something that was encapsulated by somebody who works in the voluntary simplicity discourse. His name's Mark Birch, and he's a Winnipeg-based author, but kind of adapted from the transition literature. So themes like what you've all discussed or have been discussing, economic relocalization. You know, in what ways is that possible? Where is it challenging? Can you rebuild or if not rebuild, highlight the local food economy? And, you know, how can you sort of support the work happening locally? How can you reduce fossil fuel dependence on a neighborhood scale? You know, again, this is perhaps redundant, but just to kind of meet you in conversation, the Transition Winnipeg tried to begin on a neighborhood basis. So we really tried at first to go, okay, which neighborhoods in the city, where does it make sense to do this kind of work? And it started in one neighborhood, it grew to 4. And that first neighborhood started with a garden, the Riverview Garden Society, and they did a hell of a job. They did a lot of work with the city to gain access to land on a riverbank. And there was a sociologist who was sort of convening that work there when he retired, and really created that sense of trust among neighbors, which is another, you know, it's just another thing that Transition's working hard to do, is find ways of building trust through these projects. So that garden's still operating. It does not provide for everyone's food needs, but it gets people thinking about food security, and it does build trust among neighbors there. So it reduces, to some extent, reduces fossil fuel dependence. I'll come back to that a little bit later. And then living more simply, so finding ways to produce more of our own needs rather than consume them. So we have embraced the term upskilling here, and we're trying to find ways of animating that and getting young folks involved, building that into curricula at the university where I teach, Canadian Mennonite University. I'll come back to this as well. Yeah, reconnecting with neighbors. So one of the problems that the initiating committee decided to sort of make a priority through Transition was this idea of you know, relative solitude or loneliness, right? And that creates a sense of distrust or mistrust in communities where, in urban communities in particular, where there are no you know, social requirements to interact with your neighbor. So finding ways of improving levels of trust in the neighborhood. That actually happened, like I said, through the gardening initiative. Of course, you know, it started in Totnes in England. This is actually more than 5 years ago now. You know, they came together with the same kinds of common concerns. That was the first in a global network. In terms of gardening, I mentioned, you know, this is sort of a great way of sort of thinking about the things that you consume on a regular basis, but it's also because you know, the carbon emissions from from food production are super high, right? And I'm going to assume that you've actually talked a fair amount about this already, so I don't know that I'm going to go into much detail about this. I'm going to come back to some other big issues later, but I'm not going to unpack this slide right now. And you probably also talked about this, the planetary boundaries model. This is something I almost always start with when it doesn't matter what course I'm teaching. People laugh at me for starting with this slide now. Maybe Sean, can you tell me, did you walk through this already with folks? I don't want to be too redundant. I'll get into our initiatives instead of looking at the big picture stuff.
So we haven't talked about carbon budgets in specific terms.
No? Okay.
We have talked about planetary boundaries as part of a really probably like the first session that was pretty heavy duty and had a lot of content. So I don't think it's a bad idea to go over it.
Okay, all right. Well, then I'll go over this for a moment. As again, a big picture sort of concept informing some of this local action. Well, the green target in the middle is a safe operating space for humanity and for the biosphere, and then the red zones there are the red wedges are an attempt at visually demonstrating just how far beyond our safe operating capacity we are in terms of economic, how the economy interacts with the life support system of the planet. So, you see here climate change, interference with the nitrogen cycle, biodiversity loss, and something I often call attention to is the fact that climate change is something we hear a lot about, and we hear a lot about about tackling, in terms of let's say carbon tax or whatever. But we don't often hear about these two far more important problems, biodiversity loss on a scale we haven't seen since the disappearance of dinosaurs. Interference with the nitrogen cycle, phosphorus loading here, which is sort of where we're not, operating outside the safe operating capacity in terms of phosphorus. What we are in terms of the nitrogen cycle. Nitrogen fixing is extremely important for food production. So the way we produce food is arguably causing, among other land use sort of problems, is arguably causing some of our most serious ecological, the most serious aspects of the ecological crisis, as demonstrated on this particular graphic. So that's partly why I think this is sort of a useful thing to look at. We think a lot about carbon. We don't necessarily think a lot about, the ways we use land create these even more serious problems. And just to actually, I'm just gonna zoom down to this explanation in case it's better than what I just said. The inner green shading represents the proposed safe operating space for 9 planetary systems. Red wedges, the red wedges estimate current position for each variable. So red is bad, green is good. The boundaries in each system's rate of biodiversity loss, climate change, and interference with the nitrogen cycle has already been exceeded. So that's something we might want to unpack a little bit more later. Because we don't do questions on the fly, do we? Here we'll sort of save them. Yeah. Okay. All right. Cool. Then I'll just keep going, and we'll look at some of these small initiatives. So we'll try to highlight. How are we doing here? Okay. Yeah. I'm assuming that this was also probably discussed a bit, but that economic growth roughly equates to emissions growth. Yeah, I'm not going to get into energy returns right now. That's maybe too much. But roughly economic growth is pairs with emissions growth. And so you've talked about steady state. You've talked about degrowth. You understand that the warrants for trying something else instead of assuming that growth is going to solve all of our social and ecological ills is probably a good way forward. Of course, this is problematized in a couple of different ways. One is that there is such a thing as good growth and bad growth. There are places where growth is necessary. Some folks might argue that good growth equates to something like renewable energy. You might say there are parts of the world where growing the economy will raise us to a certain level of social development. If you want to use the development ladder, and I'm sure that there are folks in the room who don't want to do that, but in any case, that's sort of the common frame. And then there's bad growth, war, crime, and poverty all in certain ways add to GDP growth. I have an anecdote that I often share about this, and that was after the Calgary floods. This is some years ago now. You know, it was seen as sort of shocking that Calgary was doing really well following the floods. In fact, Calgary was on track to do quite well after the floods because it had to rebuild, right? Just as, you know, post-pandemic, we're going to have to think about rebuilding something, and GDP will see an uptick a little bit, right? But that is that, you know, in the common narrative, that uptick in GDP will be seen as something that's sort of perhaps permanent. That any you know upward movement in GDP is going to create well-being, and that doesn't always happen. So suffering also can also create upticks in income and in growth. I mean, this is just I often like to reference this. Now, by the way, I'm just noticing my my charger doesn't seem to be working. So if I have to sort of switch up the technology in a second, I'm sorry. I'm plugged in, but it's not moving. So I may have to sort of like duck under for a second and see what I can do here. But anyway, in the meantime, I enjoy this graphic because it also highlights, you know, this notion that Sean was mentioning before, that, you know, increases in consumption of consumer goods does not necessarily improve well-being, right? So, you know, here we have a gentleman who's surrounded by all manner of cheap consumer goods that should be making him happy, and he's pretty unimpressed with it. So this is what we refer to sometimes as uneconomic growth, consumerism, Western social malaise. Some of you may have seen this kind of graphic before, that, you know, this is a cute cartoon. Happiness just around the corner. This is the rat race. Earn more money, buy more things, keep going. Happiness is just around the corner. Well, that doesn't necessarily work either. We know this is an old, oh, that's not the old thing I was thinking about, but there's another fun quote to summarize it. Tim Jackson, an ecological economist, UK-based, says that people are being persuaded to spend money we don't have on things we don't need to create impressions that won't last on people we don't care about. And that if we were to sort of reverse this order of things and our priorities, perhaps we'd see some tangible kind of growth in human well-being. This is an old statistic now, and I think it's actually quite a bit more than this at this point in time. But in any case, it demonstrates the point. Peak happiness is achieved per capita at around 30 grand Canadian. I will joke with my students sometimes that, you know, if that means, you know, if 30 grand is roughly the lottery, and we can't cognitively perceive, you know, well-being over and above that with more income, and that's not always true. There's sometimes marginal, you know, you perceive you know, happiness in something because you got something that improves your life dramatically over the long term. But, you know, generally speaking, 30 grand, that means that we've probably all already won the lottery, right? So if you've all already won the lottery, the next question becomes, what then do you do with your time, not your money? And so the question that then helps us think through what we ought to do with all of this sort of, with these, you know, framing kinds of statistics and this kind of knowledge. Okay, you know, how to reduce carbon if we're already as happy as we're going to be. If you know, if we have to reduce the scale of the economy, we got to figure out how to load less nitrogen into the oceans. We have to figure out all this stuff at the same time. You know, there are only a few paths forward at that point, right? And here's sort of one way of thinking about a path forward. Now, I know that all of these terms are fraught. Growth is fraught, sustainability is fraught, and resilience is fraught, but it gives us a way of thinking about it anyway. So I do like the term resilience. You know, it's not perfect, but I think it gets us out of the sustainability or this preservationist mindset. You know, some folks might suggest, you know, planetary healing, restoration, or restoration economy. There are all these terms that float about. But anyway, resilience is the capacity of a system, a forest, a city, or an economy. This is one of the reasons why I like it. It's very general, to deal with change and continue to develop, another fraught term, It's about the capacity to use shocks and disturbances like financial crises or climate change to spur renewal and innovative thinking. Innovation, another fraught term. But there's a whole package of fraught terms for you to think about adapting in a complex system to deal with change. And that's really what sort of what we're trying to get at there. All right, I'm going to sort of, I think I'm just going to, maybe I'll go through this list and then transition myself to a bunch of small initiatives and show you sort of where we've tried and succeeded and or failed at doing things. So why do we need to transition to a relocalized or low carbon economy, if such a thing is possible, a degrowth economy? Because we got to do it. We got to get it done as soon as possible. Growth as we measure it in income doesn't distinguish between economic goods and bads. You saw in the graphic, we're reaching biophysical limits. And then there's a couple of other things that I hope perhaps others have touched on at some point. And that's that efficiency without some kind of, yeah, right. Someone also notes that shocks is also a fraught term. All the fraught terms, disturbances maybe is the best way to go. Efficiency without sufficiency is lost, which is to say, this is another big picture idea. I'd love to go through Jevons paradox, but I don't think now's the time. Perhaps that's been done before, and if it hasn't been done, we can do it later. And growth fundamentally isn't necessarily making us any happier, or isn't improving our well-being. Happiness is another fraught term. So if those things are true, arguably then these are warrants to try something differently. And there, okay, so now we'll get to sort of the part that I think you may find hopefully some inspiration in or some hope in. And actually, since this is an actual break, I'm going to try and plug my computer in again, and I'd invite you to talk amongst yourselves for 30 seconds while I see what I can do here, because the computer will just shut off if I don't do that. 1 second. Try this instead.
It looks like we've lost him temporarily. Temporarily.
Does anyone have any questions? I might be able to answer. Does anyone want me to explain Jevons paradox? I'm not sure I did or didn't before.
That'd be cool.
Sure. Okay. So Jevons paradox is this thing that happens with that when you make something more efficient, it actually leads to net increase in the use of whatever thing you've made efficient. So if you make really great light bulbs that are super energy efficient, people actually end up using more overall electricity, because essentially you're like, oh, it's so efficient, I can use as much of it as I want. And he sort of wrote this, I think, about coal usage in 18 something or other. Like, this is quite an old paradox, but it's been empirically demonstrated for almost every resource that that trying to make resource use or materials or technology more efficient actually doesn't lead to a net reduction in the usage of that resource. And so sort of like focusing on just like, oh, we just need more innovation, we need more technology to make this possible, without accompanied social changes or sort of practices that that alone isn't a change that is gonna make a difference in sort of like the relative scarcity or usage of resources we care about.
All right.
Does that
Sorry about
make
that.
sense? Oh, perfect.
Sorry, we have power. That's the first time that's ever happened, but of course it had to happen. So,
Technology.
technology, yeah.
All right, welcome
So I
back.
explained Devin's paradox while you were away.
Okay, I'm glad. Was it fun?
I mean, edge of our seats, I think.
All right. Well, yeah. Okay, let's. Okay, so those are the big ideas. The big ideas thrust, and what we then did as Transition Winnipeg is we tried to translate that into local action. So we came up with what we called an energy descent action plan. It's a lofty idea for a small thing, but we actually managed to get a group of experts and authors to get together and write a chapter each on the areas that relate the most to this overgrowth of the economy. So food, transportation, energy, etc. I'll just show you this very briefly. And we tried to influence the civic election. So we had they actually wrote these chapters. You can find this online, transitionwinnipeg.ca, and it's posted there as a PDF. So this is some time ago now, but an introduction, sort of highlighting why it's important to work at some of these issues. Some energy. What we did also is we talked about the present situation. We envisioned the transition. What could you do to transition to a slower or a period of degrowth towards something else, steady state perhaps, and then demonstration sites of where these things have worked. Now, as I say, the issue with, of course, picking something that you think is going to work, the reason why it's impossible sometimes because it's so highly contextualized, right? Nevertheless, we have just a bag of ideas here, so to speak, a basket of ideas, and sort of like let's pick a few and see if any of these work, based on the fact that they have worked elsewhere in similar climates and similar kinds of jurisdictions. Food, transportation, urban planning. So tried to sort of bend the ear of the urban planners at the City of Winnipeg. Local economics. So how do we measure well-being, say? Community and society. So we talked a little bit about actually loneliness and the lack of trust that was pervasive throughout the suburbs, especially, but the downtown core as well. And there you have it. So this was all written out in a large sort of master document, and then it was condensed down into bullet points for the civic election. And Transition Winnipeg at that time, the last civic, I guess, this is 2 election cycles ago, actually, we managed actually to get a whole lot of airtime on the local media to sort of to influence the mayoral candidates and get them to consider some of these ideas. So one of the 3 front runners actually incorporated this as part of his election platform. He later became an MP, Robert Falcon-Ouellette, for Winnipeg Centre, so it did have some measure of, I don't know, influence over the public conversation at that time, which we were happy about. So from that, we then had, after that civic election, we then decided, okay, well, whatever the city can do, the city can do. What can we do at the neighborhood level? What we did was we hosted an idea jam. So this was an idea jam in 2015. So we brought together social entrepreneurs, policymakers, and said, what kind of low impact projects are feasible, desirable, interesting, useful, and we identified a couple of them. So one was this thing called the Farm Fresh Food Hub, and I'll talk a little bit about that very briefly. We also did a DIY upskilling festival, hosted it at the university, CMU. And so now it's sort of a working group. So in other words, teaching folks how to garden, how to make their own things. And then we tried to turn that into a permanent institution. at Canadian Mennonite University. So that's where the Center for Resilience sort of began. In a way, it's become something a little bit, something else, sort of. But in any case, we tried to take some of these ideas, kick them forward, and institutionalize them at the university. And one of the things sort of external to the university that happened was the creation of this farm fresh food hub and a local market, South Osborne market. We also have sort of the projects. I'm just going to give you an overview, and I'll do a short presentation about some of these projects. But so the Farm Fresh Food Hub has since become the Fireweed Food Co-op. So it's a functioning cooperative now. There are two co-housing initiatives that came out of this idea jam. One is the Prairie Rivers co-housing group. So they have a fully functioning, I don't think they've actually built anything yet, but they've got the social fabric sort of, it's been created. And I believe, or actually, if I'm not mistaken, they've purchased land, they just haven't built it yet. The other one that came about was the Old Grace Housing Co-op. Now this one is now fully operating. They had a very intentional process they went through to make it intergenerational. In other words, they wanted folks who were retirement age, midlife, and early career to live there. There was a tension that brewed, however, because the folks who could actually afford to build something like this largely were in their elder years, and the folks who were at early to mid stage of their life had then to find a way to sort of borrow the equity from the folks within the co-housing initiative. And that created some interesting tension and conversation. It had to be worked through. We had a great accountant who worked through that process. And the project was later financed by, and there you see Robert Falconet again at the top of the list here, who was sort of a champion of this housing cooperative. Old Grace, by the way, is it's quite a large cooperative. It's got two sites, a 60-suite complex, and then a 4-unit townhouse development, and some of it subsidized housing. So it is striving to meet some of these social criteria that were set about. From an economic perspective, what's interesting is it's non-market. So when these places are when they come up for lease or sale, as it were, then the folks who are members of the co-op and the longest standing members of the co-op are the ones who get to bid on the space or apply, I should say. They don't bid, but they apply. So those are two successful initiatives that had come out of that idea jam. Here's the Fireweed Food Co-op. So the Fireweed Food Co-op is a farm. It's essentially a food hub that tries to connect buyers and sellers of local, sustainably produced food. There's that fraught term again. So yeah, there we go. What was interesting about the creation of this co-op is it gave a number of students the ability to, so students of ours at CMU, the ability to go try their hand at farming and then sell it at an urban market where they can actually earn a livelihood. That's a challenging thing, obviously, but it's worked for, I guess, three students now are doing this full time. And then there's a bunch of others who become, who are operating this food hub. In an effort to grow the food hub and to create a market, what they did was they actually created a physical market in the same neighborhood where transition started, and it had some there was a strong desire to support the market there, partly because transition had such a strong presence. So there's another initiative that worked quite well. Oh yeah, I didn't want to close that. One of the so the third co-housing group that emerged as a result of this initiative is the one that I'm sort of participating in right now. It's a rural co-housing group. It's completely off grid, and it is being facilitated by a Buddhist community, so called the Rural Dharma Center. supports retreating, teaching, and living in community. And they do their own food production. They have hands-on mechanical learning. The gentleman who initiated this group builds his own electric vehicles, rebuilds them out of used, repurposes combustion engine vehicles, and turns them into electric vehicles. It's quite a thing to see, and I guess, etc. So they they have quite a bit going on there, and there's overlap between this group here now, and they do something called Eco Dharma on the rural side, and Transition Winnipeg on the urban side, and they sort of talk back and forth, and they support one another in their activities. How much time do I have? I want to talk about just 2 or 3 other initiatives, just as sort of a smorgasbord of
Please do, yeah. Yeah, we have time.
Okay. I think what I'll talk about first is the center, very quickly. So as I said, when Transition did this idea jam, actually no, I'm going to go back and talk about the coffee shop first. When we did this idea jam, before the idea jam happened, Transition said, "Oh goodness, how are you going to facilitate anything without, we could work out of church basements, we could work out of, boardrooms of ecological nonprofits and so on." But some of us thought it might be a nice idea to start a business and have it be sort of the home and the conversation point, the connecting point for Transition's work. So a group of us started another kind of cooperative, Fools and Horses, and we stuck it right across from the legislature in downtown Winnipeg. And we thought, okay, if the legislature's got its thing going on, we'll have our own little transition conversations going on across the street. And there may be this nice kind of interplay between sort of the formal democracy and informal democracy in this coffee shop. So we started this thing called Fools and Horses. What were we? Who are we? I am no longer a part of this, but I'll just give you a quick overview of it. Coffee shop. We also tried to become the first buyer of the food hub. So we wanted to serve only locally sourced foods and snacks, with the exception of course, the main gig, which is coffee. We can't make that here. So there's those tensions became very obvious when you start trying to do everything locally. You find out the limits of what's possible, what's desirable from a community standpoint. People still want to drink coffee, right? People still want avocado toast or whatever. So there are limits to the ideology when you start putting into practice. We served beer and wine. We had a triple bottom line. So we also that means that we tried to basically build social, ecological, economic, financial metrics into the way the business operates. Is it possible to live a sort of well-being economy when you run a coffee shop, when you run a business? And of course it is, and there are models out there, but it's a lot harder than just sort of picking metrics. We ended up with 2 locations because one at a National Historic Site because folks loved the philosophy. And so we were these 5 folks when we started. Now there are 2 left standing, and there's also a burnout factor that needs to be discussed when you start talking about community-based initiatives like Transition, like the Energy Descent Plan, like the coffee shop, and everything else that came along from it, the food hub, right? And that's also, I should say, why it was so important for us to be connected to the university, because this provided sort of a constant stream of enthusiasm. In my case, relatively young and enthusiastic Mennonites who want to enact this economy, to sort of figure out how to enact this kind of change locally. Now, this is funny. This is just funny. A group of us were in a singing group. We started. I don't know if you can. There you go. There's me in the front center there. So we. One of the reasons why we had enough trust to actually get the venture started was because we worked together, not just in Transition, but also as an arts group. Anyway, that's just sort of a silly thing. I'm not going to go through the. This is what the place looked like. So we actually made it, by sourcing as locally as possible. Managed to craft something that was also aesthetically appealing, which doesn't always work. just to narrate a couple of its elements, we were the first restaurant in the city to offer wine on tap. And that's because it reduces carbon emissions of the wine bottles that are flown or delivered from across the country and indeed across the world. So it also eliminates the need for waste. There's no spillage. There's no you reduce the amount of, so there's no bottles, reduce the amount of actual wine that's disposed of. But again, when you think about sort of when you test these new things, you realize the limits of them. And the limit of this was a branding problem. People don't want to drink tapped wine because it sounds gross. It sounds like it's wine coming from a box, right? So again, it's interesting, right? You sort of do all this work. This is a tangible example of where your ideology just doesn't work. It's just, it's a simple thing. We actually had to do some policy work with the province to make this thing work. Oh, well, people don't want to drink out of a tap. So beer, sure, there's nothing gross about that. Wine, something's off about it. So the bar that you see here is another interesting sort of locally sourced thing. So this is a, I actually went down to, you can get technology from all over the world, right? You can import, a machine that comes from China that you'll never know how to fix, or Italy, never know how to fix. And it'll function really well and make a great cup of coffee. But we decided to do it the hard way because we're doing this sort of locally sourced, we're trying to enact this locally sourced ideology. And we found these machines which are crafted in Illinois. So I thought, okay, cool, we can drive down to Illinois. It's a group of young entrepreneurs sort of creating something new. We'll learn how to fix them ourselves. And in this sort of world made by hand approach, it will be better for the world. And these things were horrible. They worked well. I should say they worked well. They pulled a good cup of coffee, but the amount of maintenance that was required was actually insane. So there too is sort of the limit to our limit to the way we tried to. It limited us in the way we tried to do things. I'm just opening the chat function here so I can make sure I'm not. You'll stop me if I'm going over time, right? You're not going to chat it?
I will, yeah. What time? We are at 12:51. I think that if you have something else to share, please do. Yeah. I think we're doing fine for time.
Okay, good. Yeah, so in any case, just two examples of how the actual business, the operational piece of this challenged our principles, right? And again, just sort of throwing it at you as kind of a, as a fun learning and a sharing. However, the thing that did function with this place was its utility as a community gathering space. It functioned extremely well as a community gathering space, and it served Transition's mission to pull people together. Not only did we have people coming out from Transition Winnipeg, we had people coming out from the Winnipeg Chamber of Commerce and from the legislature, and so it became a really great way of getting people of very different sorts in the same room after hours. And there was this sort of sexy thing about shutting down the coffee shop, opening up as an event space at night, and talking about these big ideas with the legislature sort of in the background. It's sort of it was this lovely sort of. Is this lovely dynamic thing. Yeah, I won't go into too much detail about Fools. You get sort of a general picture of what sort of happened there. Let me show you. Okay, so Fools succeeded. It was in spite of itself, and in many ways in spite of our principles, not just because of them, but also in spite of them. And I suppose the last thing I wanted to kind of share is an outcropping of, or an outgrowth of Transition Winnipeg's work is this thing at, so again, I teach at Canadian Mennonite University. CMU has been a really great proponent of Transition's work overall, has tried to sort of build it in the curriculum wherever possible, sort of embracing some of these big picture ideas that I started with. So we built a co-working space to try and keep doing the incubation work that we were doing through Transition and Fools initially. And what changed here, of course, now is that CMU is in charge of the sort of branding and marketing and everything. And so Transition kind of has hands off in many ways, but not in every way, because virtually any idea that fits with sort of low carbon planning could be dropped into the hopper at the center, and we'll try to find a way to build it into A, curriculum, and B, into like an incubation scheme of some kind of a business plan, a design project, whatever. So, and I'll give you examples of that in a second. So the center is a co-working lab for social entrepreneurs and researchers too, right? So we won't just accept anybody, but folks who are working at these sort of local level projects. It is a 6,000-foot beautiful new co-working space at the top of a castle in the middle of the city. It's this cool thing. But then there's also an initiative to use the land as an outdoor learning commons. So that's we'd envisioned having a couple of greenhouses. They're not built yet. A composting facility, which would be the operating space for Compost Winnipeg, because the city does not have an organics pickup service. We created one, and an outdoor classroom. And then we had student links. I created a course called the Social Innovation Lab. Like I said, the middle word's fraught, but whatever, it works. Transdisciplinary cohort of students where they design, propose, test, or implement solutions to the problems that are posed by a business or community organization. So they don't necessarily come up with the business plan, they could, but there are lots of existing community organizations and businesses that have these sort of ideas and actions that they want to drive forward. So what we do is we kick them to students. We say, here's a design problem, map it out, figure out how to work it through, and then test a solution. Because that's really what we did in every case, through transition. We identified, okay, this is low-hanging fruit, a project that might work. Here's another low-hanging fruit, a project that might work. All the while using these big ideas to kind of make them happen. In this case, they work in small teams and they select a topic, draft a course of action, work with me or another faculty member to make it happen. So, and I really, if there's anything that I am really proud of and excited about from all of this years of sort of meandering work, it's that particular course, because it kind of multiplies the ways we can work at problems. I've already showed you this stuff, so I'm not going to go through this. We also had, so in the land-based piece, though, it's pretty neat because we ended up with someone working at low-impact housing, turning shipping containers into housing. We ended up with Arasha is a Christian environmental stewardship organization that hails from the West Coast, and they started a branch here in Winnipeg that they do permaculture. There's a business called Low Environmental Impact Technology, which does work to try and reduce the use of chemicals in the far north. So it eliminates the need for harsh detergents. Metanoia Farmers Co-op, so the bottom graphic there is an actual farm that was started on campus at CMU, that's CMU in the background. And then on the social side, there was a home care company that was set up there. And that's just a highlight of a few. There's probably a dozen or so working out of that space now, which is really exciting. And yeah, there you go. Compost Winnipeg, Gardens Manitoba, Northern Food and Health Institute. There was a applied psychology organization. We call them entrepreneurs in residence, perhaps another fraught term, but it works. That's what the center is, or that's what it became. The thing I'll just finish up on is I'll just show you where we landed with the projects for this. So this summer, CMU said, okay, by the way, this is, I think Sean's already posted this, but this is the website that I've redesigned, postgrowth.ca. This is my personal website. And here are the courses that I teach here at CMU. We made this one, we themed the Social Innovation Lab this summer, and we just decided last week, 2 weeks ago, like, let's get something rolling so that students can kind of reclaim a bit of agency after having to sit at home for, however long and kind of despair a bit. So this theme is pandemic-related organizational adaptations of businesses, community organizations, and household self-reliance. And we have a number of community mentors, ranging from business to, this is the gentleman who runs the Rural Dharma Center, to social workers, and there are more still coming. But so in this hands-on course, as I said, this iteration offers the students to process the emotional impact the pandemic's had on them. We have, so theme broken down into the 3 sub-themes: land-based learning, designing or running energy and waste systems, and then business adaptation, so post-COVID business adaptation. And so you can sort of see you can play around and see sort of what we've got cooking there. So out of the DIY festival, this particular gentleman, for instance, is interested in designing and building outdoor kitchens. He's a plumber, and he's very interested in figuring out how he can use his skills to actually cook the food that comes from the garden outside, or in technology that uses primarily biomass and waste to cook. Animal rearing, permaculture, food aggregation from the co-op that I mentioned before, energy system design, geothermal installations. We've got a restaurant that wants to do business adaptation. That's maybe an outlier, but still, still in some ways relevant to these big picture ideas. So this stuff now really living, I guess these initiatives now really living through this particular course offering and others, ecological economics. There's this other course here titled Citizenship, Land, Economy, which is very similar. Takes some of the themes and addresses them in a less economizing kind of, with a less of an economizing kind of tone, more of a sociological tone. But yeah, that's so. I hope you can see the lineage of how some of these projects, we had this sort of big picture stuff. We had a number of projects that came out, started a bunch of things. Some worked, some didn't so well, or some worked in ways that we weren't expecting. But at the end of the day, what we have left now is this center, and we have this course and a range of other courses that are basically trying to replicate that same process to make sure that this work keeps happening somehow at the community level. So there you go. I just threw a whole lot of crap at you in like a scattered form, and I hope that was kind of fun and will prompt a whole bunch of conversation.
Thank you, James. That's a lot.
Yeah, it is a lot.
Yeah, thanks. All right, so I'm just going to open it up right now just for any clarifying questions before we take a break.
Okay. Yeah.
And so I'm just going to do an example of what is a clarifying question and what isn't.
Cool.
So a clarifying question would be something like, oh shoot, my screen is funny. What is voluntary simplicity discourse?
Mm-hmm.
And a clarifying question is not, is a post-growth economy possible at the local level if it's not a national policy goal? Bigger questions we can have discussions or bring to you after our discussion time. But for now, can I just, I can't see you all right now, but I trust that you're there. And if there are questions that are clarifying questions, please ask them now.